African Americans have been in Kansas since before the Civil War. They wanted what all settlers wanted, a chance to choose their future. Many of them came after the Civil War because they saw Kansas as a land of freedom. They had learned about John Brown as well as the stories of the Underground Railroad supporters. This gave them the idea that Kansas was the promised land. Kansas was larger in the 1860s than it is today. One of the many anti-slave supporters, also sometimes called an abolitionist, was James Lane. He assisted in getting slaves from the southern states of slavery to the freedom that could be gained in Canada. The Underground Railroad would use everyday homes like this one that was along the trail. Lane developed this trail in the state that would link up with other trails throughout the United States. In an attempt to keep the African Americans safe, they had to be hidden, sometimes in attics, cellars, or tunnels. Even before Kansas became a state, there was a settlement of runaway slaves within the boundaries of the territory. It was established in 1857 near what is known today as Kansas City, Kansas. Quindaro was the area the escapees would first reach free soil. They would sometimes move on to the Happy Hollow colony nearby. During this time, the Wyandot Indians surrounded the area. It is known that eventually about 110 farming families were known to have lived in that area. When Kansas became a state on January 29th of 1861, it entered the United States as a free state. A few short months later, the Civil War began. Even with Kansas being a free state, it was on the border. And just as the country was divided, so was Kansas. There were places that didn't want blacks in their neighborhoods, towns, or communities. Some of these towns became known as sundown towns. Here is a list of towns that is believed to have been sundown towns in Kansas, based on census reports. This is a map showing just how widespread the problem was across the state. With the end of the Civil War, the African Americans were looking for a way to begin their new lives of freedom. Organizations within Kansas sent out flyers as well as representatives to encourage them to settle in Kansas. Many of the African Americans traveled the many rivers to arrive in Kansas. According to the website sponsored by the Black Town Project organization, they settled in these counties across the state. It was believed that for the African Americans to have a chance of a future in Kansas, they would need to have their own town. So Nicodemus was formed, an Indiana land developer, as well as the Reverend W.H. Smith, worked together to form the Nicodemus Town Company. The Nicodemus Town Company promoted to colored people of the United States to come and settle in the Great Solomon Valley. The first settler to arrive in 1877 was the Reverend Roundtree. He worked with Benjamin Pap Singleton, a black carpenter who was a prior slave, to continue to spread the word about Kansas. Many of the early settlers arrived from Kentucky. In the late fall, they did not have time to build a home before the harsh winter would arrive, so they built temporary homes called dugouts. Nicodemus brought the state its first black elected official, Edward P. McCabe. McCabe was the Nicodemus Town Company elected secretary and later the state auditor. Governor St. John appointed him to Graham County Clerk's office in April of 1880. After the railroad failed to be located in Nicodemus, the population dwindled. Nicodemus currently currently has 40 residents and is listed as a National Historical Site. The descendants of the original settlers returned to Nicodemus in July to celebrate their heritage. Benjamin Singleton, who was sometimes known as Pap, sparked many of the blacks that became known as the Exodusters to migrate to Kansas from 1879 to 1881. It is said he was responsible for the movement of 300 African Americans to Kansas. He aided in the development of 3 separate colonies in the state: Singleton, Tennesseetown, and Dunlap. Dunlap was his best attempt. It was funded with the aid of the Southern Refugee Relief Association as well as the Presbyterian Church. Governor St. John was a big part of the Southern Refugee Relief Association. It was in response to the large numbers of refugees that had arrived within the state with little to no resources available to them. Dunlap offered the freed slaves a free education to young and old. There was a problem with the location in the town. Even with the soil being rich for farming, it was located too close to the Nasisco River. It would flood the area and could make farming difficult. It was recorded in 1993 to have flooded 10 times. Therefore, the farmers would have to replant or wait till later in the season to get their planting done. Dunlap is currently known as a ghost town in Kansas. The last African American to reside in Dunlap was London A. Harness. He was buried in 1993 in the Dunlap Black Cemetery. Many African Americans came to Kansas and didn't receive all they thought they should receive based on the stories that they had been told. Even so, Abraham Lincoln had passed the Homestead Act in 1862. This did entitle them to land within the state for a small filing fee, plus they had to improve the land within 5 years. With the many disadvantages of the people as well as the land, many didn't succeed and returned to the South. Most African American colonies established during this time frame lasted only a few months or years. Lack of economic opportunities or drought years were the common causes for dwindling populations in the entire region. Colonies in Wyandotte and Shawnee County became part of the bigger, larger town nearby and are now part of Kansas City and Topeka, Kansas. In some cases, remnants of buildings or foundations are still visible, such as in the Quidaro, while at other colony sites it has become part of a pasture or cultivated field, such as in Hogman Center. In Wabaunsee and Dunlap colonies, cemeteries testify to their prior existence. They had many battles to overcome with the land, the weather, the economy, as well as other people around them. Some moved on to other places, and some stayed and made their way for their descendants to succeed. Some examples of famous African Americans from Kansas represented in many walks of life are included here. While the percentage of African Americans in Kansas has always been small, the very beginning of Kansas was wrapped up in the fate of the African Americans.